Rain fell against the diner windows like whispered secrets, each droplet racing downward as if desperate to tell its story before disappearing into darkness. November had settled over rural Pennsylvania with the weight of a gravestone. Inside the fluorescent-lit diner, coffee cups steamed with quiet urgency while the late-night crowd, truckers, insomniacs, souls between destinations, occupied their usual corners. Behind the counter stood Maya, a woman of 28 years, whose eyes held the exhaustion of someone who'd stopped dreaming a long time ago. Her movements were practiced, almost mechanical. Pour, serve, wipe, repeat. The apron she wore bore stains from 1,000 anonymous meals, each one a small weight added to her shoulders. Her fingers, long and elegant despite their calluses, moved with the precision of a pianist who'd never learned an instrument. It was on an ordinary Tuesday, at 8:43 in the evening, that everything changed. A black car pulled to the curb outside. Through the rain-streaked glass, Maya caught glimpses of chrome and polish, the kind of vehicle that had never belonged in this neighborhood. The door opened. A man emerged, charcoal coat raised against the cold, his silhouette belonging to a different world entirely. He carried photographs in one hand, like tarot cards that had already predicted the future he entered. The door chimed, a sound that had become so familiar to Maya that she usually didn't hear it anymore. But this time she did. Her hands froze. The coffee pot she'd been holding slipped from her grip and shattered against the floor. Ceramic shards scattered like broken promises. Coffee bloomed across the white tile in shades of mahogany and rust. The man waited patiently, while Maya knelt to gather the pieces. Her hands trembled as she swept. She could feel his eyes on her, not with judgment, but with the intensity of someone searching for something they'd been looking for a very long time. When she finally seated him in a booth by the window, he didn't order food. His suit was tailored, his hands manicured, his bearing unmistakably that of someone accustomed to authority. He slid a photograph across the laminate table with the deliberation of someone presenting evidence. "Do you know this child?" His voice was calm, measured, the voice of a lawyer or a priest, someone trained in the delivery of truths too heavy for ordinary speech. The boy in the photograph was perhaps 9 years old, expensive school uniform, dark hair, green eyes that held a mixture of intelligence and sorrow, the angle of his nose, the shape of his mouth, features that seemed to echo her own reflection. Maya's breath caught. She didn't know this child. She'd never seen him before, and yet something in his face sent ice through her veins. "My name is Richard Sterling," the man continued, his eyes never leaving her face. "I'm an attorney, and I believe you may be the only person who can help me find the truth about this boy." The diner seemed to hold its breath. Outside, the rain continued its ancient conversation with the earth. Inside, questions hung in the air like smoke. Who was this child? Why did he resemble her so closely? And why had a stranger chosen this particular moment, this particular rainy evening, to ask her these questions? But before any of these questions could be answered, the story needed to fold backward through time. It needed to return to a moment 10 years earlier, to a day when a shy waitress made a choice that would echo across a decade, like ripples from a stone dropped into still water. To understand that moment of reckoning, we must go back. We must return to when Maya was 17 years old, when she still believed in possibility, when the world seemed full of space for her own small dreams. It was a September morning, golden with early autumn light. The diner was busy with the breakfast crowd. Farmers, construction workers, people whose hands were already dirty from work before 9 in the morning. Maya moved between the tables with natural grace, her blonde hair pulled back with a simple elastic, her apron already stained with syrup and coffee. She was thin, not from elegance, but from years of choosing between saving for college and eating 3 meals a day. The boy appeared as if from nowhere, stepping through the door with the cautious movements of someone entering dangerous territory. He was perhaps 9 years old, dressed in a uniform that identified him as belonging to Ashford Academy, a prestigious boarding school 30 miles north, the kind of place where families with old money sent their children to become even more themselves. His face was pale, almost translucent, and his eyes held a depth of fear that no child's eyes should hold. He sat in the corner booth, the one by the kitchen where he could be invisible. Maya, unlike the other servers, noticed him immediately, not because of his expensive uniform or his out-of-place appearance, but because she recognized something in his expression, the particular loneliness of someone who'd learned that the world was not safe. She'd seen that expression in her own mirror often enough to know it. Without being asked, without calculating the risk to her meager wages, Maya brought him hot chocolate, not because it was on the menu or because he'd ordered it, but because she understood that hot chocolate was sometimes a language of kindness that transcended the normal rules of commerce and distance. The boy looked at it as if it might disappear. "It's okay," Maya said softly, and she meant it about much more than the chocolate. "You're okay here." During her break, a 15-minute window she risked losing if the manager discovered her, Maya sat across from him in the booth. They didn't speak much. Words seemed unnecessary. The boy told her his name was Thomas. He told her, in fragments and hesitations, that he attended Ashford Academy, but that his home, and he paused here, as if searching for a word that might adequately describe what he was running from. His home was not a safe place. He'd run away this morning. He didn't know where he was going. He was terrified of being found. And Maya, 17 years old, with a mother who'd raised her alone in a diner that always smelled of burnt toast and old regrets, with dreams of journalism and stories and a life far away from this small town, made a choice. She wrote down the address of the Greyhound station. She gave him $40, money she'd been saving for textbooks, money that she could barely spare. And most importantly, most impossibly, she gave him something precious, a silver locket that had belonged to her mother. Inside the locket was a photograph of 2 young women standing in a garden, their arms linked, their faces bright with a joy that suggested they couldn't imagine a world in which they might ever be separated. "That's my mother," Maya said, pointing to the woman on the left. "And that's my Aunt Eleanor. I've never met her. My mother doesn't talk about her. But I want you to have this so you know what it feels like to be part of someone. So you know that people exist who are connected to you, even if you can't reach them. Someone cares about you, even if it's just a waitress in a diner." Thomas took the locket with shaking hands. He cried, not dramatically, but with the deep, silent tears of a child who'd been carrying too much alone. Then, as suddenly as he'd appeared, he left. He walked out into the morning, clutching the locket and the address and the memory of someone who'd treated him like he mattered. Maya never saw him again. That afternoon, her mother noticed the locket was gone. She didn't ask questions immediately, but something in her expression shifted, a tightening around the eyes, a thinning of the mouth. That evening, as they closed the diner, her mother finally spoke about Eleanor. "She was my sister," her mother said, and in those 4 words, Maya heard decades of carried pain. "We were close, closer than close. We shared secrets and dreams and promises that we'd never leave each other. But she got pregnant when she was 21. Out of wedlock. Our family. They couldn't bear the shame of it. They paid her to disappear. They told me I wasn't permitted to mention her name again. I was 18. I was young. I obeyed." Her mother's voice broke like thin ice under weight. "I've regretted it every day of my life. I let my family erase someone I loved more than anyone, and I never even fought for her. That's what I regret. Not her choices. My silence." That night, sitting by the fireplace in their small apartment above the diner, her mother took Maya's hands. "Never choose silence when you can choose kindness," she said, "even if it costs you everything, especially then." Years passed. Maya didn't go to college. She couldn't afford to leave. She worked in the diner just as her mother did, and the life she'd once dreamed of, journalism, stories, a world beyond these walls, became something she thought about in quiet moments, and then set aside. She learned to make peace with small possibilities. Her mother died when Maya was 25, cancer that moved through her body like an invading army, quiet and efficient. In her final days, as she lay in a hospital bed, with machines humming their mechanical breath around her, she held Maya's hand. "Find the truth," she whispered. "About Eleanor. About what happened. Tell the story. Don't let silence win. Promise me." Maya promised. She didn't know then what that promise would ask of her. She couldn't have imagined the weight it would eventually carry. For 3 years after her mother's death, Maya existed in the diner like a ghost, present in body, absent in spirit. She was 28, but moved like someone much older. She'd stopped hoping for anything beyond the next shift, the next paycheck, the careful mathematics of survival. The locket she'd given away had become a symbol of everything she'd sacrificed, and nothing she'd gained. She'd forgotten that small act of kindness, or perhaps she'd simply accepted that it had been absorbed into the vast indifference of the universe, that it had mattered to no one, changed nothing. But the universe, it seemed, had other plans. It began with a scandal that rippled through the news like electricity through water. The Sterling family, Billionaire's dynasty, old money, and older sins, was coming apart. Edward Sterling, the patriarch, had died. His will was being contested. His son, Thomas Sterling, was claiming inheritance that had been systematically denied him. Thomas claimed to be the illegitimate son of Edward Sterling and a woman named Eleanor, a woman who'd been paid off and sent away 3 decades prior. The Sterling family denied everything. They had documentation to prove Eleanor had signed away all rights to inheritance, to the Sterling name, to anything that might tie her or her child to their legacy. They were prepared to bury this claim beneath mountains of legal precedent and family wealth. But Thomas had found an uncle, Richard Sterling, Edward's younger brother, a man who'd chosen law as a path toward justice rather than toward the accumulation of power. Richard looked at the evidence and saw what the family was hiding. He investigated. He discovered the hospital records. He found the birth certificate. He traced Eleanor's life through the decades and discovered that she'd spent her entire existence searching for a son she'd been forced to surrender, that she'd written thousands of letters she never sent, that she'd maintained a safety deposit box containing nothing but photographs and memories of a child she never got to raise. Richard also discovered something else. Eleanor's family. Eleanor had a sister. That sister had a daughter. That daughter lived in Pennsylvania. That daughter worked in a diner. He came to find her on an ordinary Tuesday, in the rain, carrying photographs and the weight of a truth that was about to shatter her small, careful world. After Richard Sterling left the diner that night, after he'd presented the photograph and asked his impossible question, the townspeople found out about the connection. Local news outlets, desperate for content, for stories that might elevate them above the background noise of anonymous media, began digging. They published articles with headlines screaming about the small-town waitress connected to Billionaire scandal. They didn't know the details. They didn't need to. The story, incomplete and sensationalized, was already irresistible. Reporters arrived at the diner with cameras and questions. They crowded the parking lot, blocking customers from entering. They called her at home at all hours. They speculated wildly online. Gold digger, fortune hunter, someone willing to exploit a family tragedy for money. The comments came from strangers who didn't know her, who'd never looked in her eyes or heard her voice. Strangers who felt empowered by anonymity to make pronouncements about her character, her motives, her worth. The town she'd grown up in turned on her. Mrs. Henderson from the grocery store stopped greeting her. The man who cut hair at the barber shop asked her not to come back. Even people who'd known her since childhood seemed to recast her as a stranger, a threat, someone who'd been living among them under false pretenses. The diner manager called her into his office with a wan smile and suggested she take a leave of absence until things settled down. Everyone understood that was a euphemism for dismissal. Within 2 weeks, Maya had lost her job, her reputation, and what little remained of her sense of belonging. One evening, alone in the apartment above the diner, having spent the day ignoring phone calls from strangers and reporters, Maya was sorting through boxes of her mother's belongings. She'd been meaning to organize them for 3 years. Grief had a way of procrastinating its own processing. At the bottom of one box, beneath old photographs and recipes written in her mother's familiar handwriting, she found an envelope. Her name was written on it in ink that had faded slightly with time. The letter inside was dated just 3 weeks before her mother's death. Her hands shook as she opened it. "My darling Maya," the letter began, and Maya could hear her mother's voice in the words, that particular cadence of love and regret that had characterized everything her mother said in those final months. "If you're reading this, I'm gone. I'm sorry I couldn't tell you the whole truth while I lived, but I need you to know something, and I'm trusting that you'll be brave enough to hear it." The girl in the locket photograph, the one on the left, standing next to Eleanor. That was me. The photo was taken the week before Eleanor disappeared from my life. I was holding her hand that day, and I didn't know I was saying goodbye. When you gave that boy the locket, I understood what you were doing. You were doing what I couldn't do. You were choosing kindness over silence. You were choosing family even when family had been erased. That boy's name was Thomas. He was Eleanor's son. He was my nephew, and I should have claimed him. I should have fought for him. I didn't. That's my greatest failure. But you did what I couldn't. You gave him something precious when he had nothing. You reminded him that someone in this world saw him and believed he mattered. If you ever see him again, tell him his mother loved him with a ferocity that moved mountains of time. Tell him Eleanor never stopped searching. Tell him he was never forgotten. Tell him the truth. Be the voice I was too afraid to be. I love you. I'm sorry I was silent when I should have spoken. Mom. The letter fell from Maya's hands. She understood now. The kindness she'd given 10 years ago, it wasn't random. It wasn't a small, isolated act that disappeared into nothing. It was connected to her. It was connected to her family's story, to Eleanor's exile, to the hole in her mother's heart that had never healed. By the next morning, Richard Sterling called. He asked if they could meet. He came to her apartment and sat at her small kitchen table with coffee growing cold between them. He brought documents, hospital records, DNA tests, letters that Eleanor had written and never sent, photographs spanning decades. He brought proof of the forged documents, the elaborate lie that Edward Sterling had constructed to hide his theft. He brought the truth, piece by piece, like someone assembling a puzzle that had been deliberately scattered. Your mother wrote about Eleanor constantly in private letters, Richard explained. Once I found those letters, I started searching for the family. I found you. He also brought something else. He placed it gently on the table between them. The silver locket. Maya's breath stopped. She recognized it immediately. The weight of it, the small dent on one side where it had been dropped when she was 12, the way the light caught the silver. Her locket, the one she'd given away 10 years ago. Thomas has kept this safe, Richard said quietly. He didn't know what it meant at first. It was just something a kind stranger had given him when he was desperate. But when he began investigating his own past, when he found Eleanor's name and Eleanor's letters and Eleanor's family history, he realized the locket was a clue. He found you through it. The revelation of truth happened in a small courtroom on a gray December morning. Richard had gathered evidence and witnesses. He'd prepared a legal case so thorough, so airtight that Edward Sterling's lawyers seemed to shrink beneath the weight of it. The courtroom was modest, almost anonymous, but the proceedings were anything but. Richard presented documents. He presented DNA evidence. He presented Thomas Sterling himself, now 18 years old, bearing the undeniable physical resemblance to Eleanor, to Maya's mother, to Maya herself. He presented elderly women who had known Eleanor, who testified about her character, her devotion to her missing child, the letters she'd written. And he presented the locket. This silver locket, Richard explained to the judge, contains DNA evidence that connects Maya, Eleanor's granddaughter, to Eleanor herself through Maya's mother. It also contains the photograph of Eleanor as a young woman. More importantly, it contains the story of kindness. A young girl, not knowing she was connected to this family, gave this locket to a frightened child who turned out to be Eleanor's son. That locket is not just evidence. It's a symbol of the truth this family tried to hide for 3 decades. Edward Sterling's widow sat in the gallery, her face gray, her eyes fixed on something no one else could see. The younger son, Thomas's half-brother, looked as if he was watching his entire world crumble in real time. Because it was. The forged documents were exposed. The handwriting didn't match Eleanor's actual signature from the hospital records. The inconsistencies were devastating. The documents were clearly fraudulent, created years after Eleanor was supposedly paid off, created specifically to give Edward Sterling legal cover for his theft. The truth was laid bare. Edward Sterling had stolen his brother's inheritance. He'd paid Eleanor to disappear. He'd paid her family to erase her. He'd constructed an elaborate legal lie to hide it all. Thomas, Eleanor's legitimate son, was the rightful heir to a substantial portion of the Sterling fortune. When the judge ruled in Thomas's favor, the courtroom seemed to exhale. Outside, reporters crowded the courthouse steps, but this time, the narrative had changed. This wasn't a scandal. This was justice. This was a hidden family discovered, a truth recovered, a wrong righted by something as simple and powerful as a silver locket and the kindness of a stranger. Maya stood on the courthouse steps in the gray December light, and for the first time in 3 years, she felt something shift inside her. The weight that had been sitting on her chest, the weight of grief, of shame, of silence, began to lift. That evening, in a quiet hotel restaurant overlooking the city lights, Maya met Thomas Sterling for the first time as an adult. He was tall, composed, bearing the weight of privilege with the self-awareness of someone who understood its cost. He placed the locket on the table between them, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. "I've carried this for 10 years, Thomas finally said. "I didn't know who gave it to me. I didn't know what it meant. I just knew it was precious. I knew someone had given it to me when I had nothing, when I was broken and lost. I kept it safe because it was the only proof that someone in this world had ever cared whether I lived or died." He looked at Maya, and his eyes held tears. "Then I found out who you were. I found out about Eleanor. I found out about my mother, about the lies, about everything that had been stolen from us, and I understood that the locket wasn't random. It was a bridge. It was meant to bring us together." Thomas reached across the table and took Maya's hand. "Thank you," he said simply, "for that moment, for that kindness, for being the person my mother couldn't find. But I did, through you." They cried together. They sat together in the strange grace of finally understanding why they'd been brought together at all, not by chance, but by something deeper, something that moved through the world like an invisible thread connecting souls across time. The settlement was finalized. Thomas established a foundation in Eleanor's name, a scholarship fund for students in crisis, for children who needed rescue, for young people who'd been abandoned by the systems that were supposed to protect them. He funded it with $500,000. The first scholarship went to a woman named Maya, admitted to a state university's journalism program. Maya completed her degree. She became a journalist. She told stories, not just her own, but stories of hidden families, of stolen inheritances, of ordinary people caught in extraordinary circumstances. Her first article was about Eleanor. It won regional awards. It won national recognition. Universities asked her to speak. Publications wanted to publish her work. The kindness loop completed itself in ways she couldn't have predicted. But more than that, more than the scholarships or the journalism career or the financial inheritance that Thomas arranged for her, something else was restored. Her mother's memory was vindicated. The town learned the truth, that her mother hadn't been complicit in any betrayal, that she'd been a victim of family cruelty and forced silence. The diner, where it had all begun, became a small landmark in the town's consciousness. People began saying things like, "That's where Eleanor's story started," and "That's where kindness saved a child." Thomas purchased the diner. He renovated it with careful attention to its history. On one wall, he hung the locket, framed and preserved, with a plaque beneath it that read, "One act of kindness changed everything." November 2013, December 2023. The diner became something new, not just a place to eat, but a community center, a safe place for lost children, for runaways, for anyone who needed a moment of refuge and kindness. And behind the counter, in a new apron, but with the same grace and gentleness that had always defined her movements, stood Maya. She was 29 years old, but she moved like someone who'd finally stopped running from her own life. When a lost child came through the door, and they came regularly now, she didn't treat them like problems. She treated them like people. She gave them hot chocolate. She listened. She told them about Eleanor and Thomas and a locket that had changed the course of history. "You're going to be okay," she told them. "Someone cares. I promise. I know it doesn't feel like it right now, but someone cares, and that matters more than you know." The locket hung on the wall, catching the morning light, casting small shadows that told their own story. And in that diner, in that small town in Pennsylvania, the cycle continued. Kindness giving to kindness, one act of compassion creating ripples that spread outward through time, changing lives in ways that no one could predict, but everyone could feel. What we have witnessed is not merely a story of betrayal exposed or fortunes restored. It is a reminder of something we often forget in a world that moves too quickly to notice the small things. Kindness does not dissolve. It does not evaporate into nothing. It echoes across years, across oceans, across generations, waiting for its moment to transform everything. 10 years ago, a shy waitress gave $40 and a precious locket to a frightened boy. She had no reason to believe it mattered. The world had given her no indication that small acts of mercy ever change anything. And yet they do. They always do. Eleanor's story teaches us that silence can imprison as powerfully as chains. But Maya's choice teaches us that courage doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it offers hot chocolate to a stranger. Sometimes it simply says, "I see you. You matter. I believe in you." Edward Sterling believed he'd stolen a family and erased the truth. But truth cannot be murdered. It lives in lockets and letters. It lives in the eyes of a boy who remembers kindness when he's most lost. It lives in the hearts of those brave enough to speak it, no matter the cost. This is the world's oldest law, and the simplest. What we give returns to us, not always in the way we expect, not always on the timeline we'd prefer, but it returns. Kindness returns. Honesty returns. Betrayal, too. It returns to those who choose it. If this story touched your heart, if it reminded you that kindness matters, that one small act of compassion can rewrite the story of a life, subscribe, like, and share. I read every comment. I believe every story matters. Yours does too. Thank you for listening.